Again, the session will be recorded. Please turn off your camera if you do not wish to have your image captured. As we wait for others to join us, I see some are in the waiting room. If you would please take a moment and in the chat box, answer the question, what do you think of climate change? When you hear the word climate change, what comes to mind? There are no right or wrong answers at this point. We're just trying to gauge where you're at and where you're coming from. So again, as we're waiting for other participants to join us, if you would just take a moment, and I see we have some others joining us. So as you're joining us, take a moment in the chat pod and answer the question, what do you think of when you hear the word climate change? Again, we've got some others joining us, so we'll wait for them. As we're waiting for that, I'm going to introduce our presenter. Today, our presenter is Mr. William Errickson. He is an ANR agent, which stands for Agriculture and Natural Resources Agent for Rutgers Cooperative Extension. Rutgers Cooperative Extension programs are open to all. And for this afternoon, I would like all of you to demonstrate the following. Please remain on mute unless you are asked to unmute. Please participate in the conversation in the chat pod. At various points, we may ask you to unmute yourself so that we can get some real-time answers from you. Please remember that we are setting examples for others to follow. And I mean, it all boils down to, this is what I call it, the grammar rule. What's the grammar rule? Don't share anything on here you wouldn't share with your grandma. But as I look at our participants and I see some of our answers, I don't think that's going to be a problem. So at this point, I'm going to stop sharing. And if you haven't done so already, I would like all of you to take a moment in the chat pod and answer the question, what do you think of when you hear the word climate change? And I see Maya's already contributed. Maya says serious. I agree, Maya. That's a good answer. Oh, we have another participant there. So at this point, I'm going to spotlight my friend and colleague, Mr. Erickson. Bill, how are you?
Good. Hi, everyone. How you doing?
Good. So I have another participant, as we're answering the questions here, Bill, writes privately, and that's fine, weather. So far we've got serious and weather when we hear climate change. What do you think of, Bill, when you hear climate change?
I think those are great responses, and it is a serious issue. It's something that affects every person on the planet, and not just every person, but animals too. So everything, every living being on the planet, it affects. So it's a pretty serious issue, but there's also opportunities, and we'll talk about some of that during the lecture tonight, in that there's some really innovative and creative ways that we need to start thinking to overcome this major challenge.
So Bill, as we get going here, can I just share with our participants, I did go over some of the ground rules. If they have any questions, what's the best way? Is it to write the question in the chat pod? Is it to unmute themselves? What do you feel most comfortable with?
I'd say write the question in the chat pod, and then we can take breaks throughout the lecture, and I'll try to answer the questions as best as possible, and then we'll have more time at the end.
I will be monitoring the chat pod, so if you do have any questions at all, please feel free to ask, and I'll make sure, Bill, I'll apologize in advance. I'm going to interrupt you if we get the questions.
It's okay.
All right. So I think, are you pulling up your slides then, or?
Ready?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Can everybody see that?
Yes, sir. I see
Okay.
some thumbs up.
Great. Okay. Hello, everyone. Bill Erickson, as Matt mentioned. I'm the Agriculture and Natural Resource Agent in Monmouth County and an assistant professor at Rutgers University. And so my work, what I do day to day, is working with farmers in our state and in our county, helping them to have more sustainable businesses, have their farms be more environmentally and economically sustainable and and just answer any questions they might have, help with pest and disease control, and also to help them adapt to their farms in preparation for the changing climate that we're finding ourselves in. So today's talk is going to be about the impacts of climate change on agriculture and the food system. So briefly, some of the things that we're going to talk about today. First, we'll cover what is climate change, and it's a very complex topic, as you might know. So we're going to do a surface level explanation of climate change, and I'm going to provide resources and links for you that if you want to go more in depth on any particular topic, you'll have those resources available. You can look them up online. Next, we'll talk about the impacts on agriculture and on our food system. How are these changes going to impact food production? And then we'll talk about some strategies for mitigation and adaptation. And those are ways that farms and all of us really can both adapt to the changing climate, but the mitigation strategies are ways that we can actually combat climate change. We can sort of work in the other direction and keep things from going too far and changing too much. So we'll look at some of those strategies and things that everyone can do. So what is climate change? And this is part of the definition that comes from NASA. And what we're talking about is a long-term change in the average weather patterns that have come to define Earth's local, regional, and global climates. So they have a broad range of observed effects that are synonymous with the term. So one person asked, what's the difference between climate and weather, or mentioned they think of weather when we talk about climate change. And so weather is definitely a component of it. But when we're talking about climate, it's more long-term process. And the weather is, oh, it's sunny out today, or it's going to rain next week. Whereas the climate is over many years, what happens from year to year, hundreds of years, thousands of years, that makes up the climate. And also, as stated by NASA, we're seeing changes in the Earth's climate now since the early 20th century that are being driven by human activities, in particular fossil fuel burning. And what that does is it traps heat-trapping gases, such as carbon dioxide, and the Earth's atmosphere, and that raises the Earth's average surface temperature. And so you might also hear the term global warming being used interchangeably with climate change. And global warming is a part of climate change. And so, as we'll see, the surface temperature of the Earth and of the oceans is rising. That would be global warming. But there's other effects as well. So there's drought and flooding and other aspects of the climate that are changing in addition to the warming. So warming is one piece of climate change, whereas climate change refers to sort of this bigger, more complex issue. So first, I want to briefly talk about the carbon cycle. So I'm a soil scientist and plant physiologist and horticulturalist, and so we're going to talk about soil and plants a little bit. But the carbon cycle has to do with the way carbon dioxide and carbon circulates on the planet. And this is a normal process. So all living things, plants, people, animals, everything that's alive is made up of carbon. So it's the fundamental elemental building block of all life. Plants have a process called photosynthesis, and they're able to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and use it to build their leaves, their roots, their stems, and it gets stored inside the plants. So plants are made up of carbon, and everything that eats plants, all the animals that eat the plants, also made up of carbon. When plants break down, so after the leaves fall off the trees and they start to decompose, all of that carbon goes into the soil, and the microbes that decompose the leaves and turn them into soil, they release that carbon back into the atmosphere. So it's sort of this cycle, this carbon flow of it going from the atmosphere into the biosphere where there's living things, and then into the pedosphere, which is down in the soil underground. And then it gets released back into the atmosphere. So that's the natural process. It's been going on for millions of years since the Earth was created. So it's a infographic showing some tree growing and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And in the soil, in that pedosphere stored, we have fossil fuels. And fossil fuels are very high in carbon. So this is stored underground. And they're high in carbon because they're made of decomposing fossilized remains of prehistoric dinosaurs, plant life, things that have broken down, and the carbon from them remains stored in the soil. So it's been locked up underground in the soil for millions of years. So we've got a certain amount of carbon in the atmosphere and a certain amount underground. And it remained largely unchanged for hundreds of thousands of years. But then we started extracting some of the fossil fuels. We found out that we could use them for energy, and that's had great advances for us in civilization. But this took a lot of that carbon dioxide from underground, and when we burn it in our engines and machinery, that carbon that was underground is released as carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So now there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than there ever has been before because we've released it from underground. And this causes a challenge because it creates something called the greenhouse effect. So carbon dioxide and other gases, they're in the atmosphere, they surround the Earth, and they sort of act as a blanket to insulate the Earth. And when the sun rays hit the planet and warm it up, these gases are able to trap that heat close to the planet. So we need a certain amount of carbon dioxide and other gases surrounding the planet in the atmosphere. Otherwise, we wouldn't warm up. But as the concentration of carbon dioxide increases, it can be too much. So things are starting to heat up. And this is where we see that global warming. So this is some really interesting science. This is paleoclimatology. And so this is studying the climate from a very long time ago. And what researchers have been able to do in places like Antarctica and Greenland, for example, where there's very old ice sheets, is they take these ice cores, and some of them go 2 miles deep into solid ice. And when they pull out the core, they can measure the different layers that have, from geological history. And some of those layers are hundreds of thousands of years old. And they can measure the concentration of carbon dioxide that was present during that time. And they can also get temperature data and correlate the two. And so they get very accurate information from measuring these ice cores. And what they have found, and what the graph up top is showing, that for the last 800,000 years, carbon dioxide and temperature have followed a similar pattern. So when carbon dioxide increases, temperature increases. And then carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere go down, then the temperature would decline. And you can see there's natural fluctuations over years, but those two things are very closely linked. So if temperature goes up, so does carbon dioxide, and vice versa. So their concentrations are very similar. We'll also see that it's never really gotten very much above 300 parts per million. So you can see on the very right of that graph, CO2 ppm, that ppm stands for parts per million. And that's how they measure how much carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere. So this is our current, So currently we're very much higher than the last 800,000 years. So we're going into uncharted territory for carbon dioxide concentrations. And you can see that chart, which is similar to the one that we looked at before, where it's going up and down, since 800,000 years ago. up until the 0 mark, which is about 1950. And it never really got above 300. So for all that time, it had some ups and downs, but never above 300.
So Bill, I don't know if you can see in my comments there, I see that and I'm just like, whoa, that's a huge.
It went up very quickly and very recently, and we're at about 412, 415 ppm right now. And we've never been that high. And there's no, in all of the ice cores that they've extracted, there's no indication that we've ever been anywhere near this level.
And Bill,
So,
I see in our comments here, Vivian asked, what would you say is one of the main contributors to this spike in CO2?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so if you think about, what has happened since then, it's the Industrial Revolution, and it's largely the burning of fossil fuels. So the fossil fuels, the carbon that was in them used to be in the ground, and we started using it for our vehicles, to generate electricity, to generate heat. And we're talking about oil and gas and things. And also plastics are petroleum products. So many of these things that have brought, great convenience and advances to our civilization, but there was this drawback that we didn't know until now. When all of these technologies were being invented, we didn't understand the effect or have the tools to really measure this impact. And now, so we've gotten to this point where we're starting to realize what's happening, and we have to figure out what to do about it.
Chris now asked, how long does it take CO2 to go from the atmosphere to the biosphere through plants?
That's a good question. And I believe there have been studies that would trace an individual molecule of carbon dioxide. And I think it depends. It could go up into the atmosphere and not make its way back into plants for a very long time. But if plants' leaves just happen to absorb that CO2 molecule, it could also be very quick. So that's a really good question, a really interesting question.
And I'll be full disclosure, all the cards on the table right now. I'm so glad you're here to answer these questions, because holy cow, these are some very knowledgeable, thoughtful questions. I want to thank our participants for asking these questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Matt. And I don't see the chat on mine. So yeah, just relay them to me and I will do my best to answer them, but you guys might stump me.
We got this. Teamwork makes the dream work.
So CO2 levels right now are at their highest levels ever in the history of the planet, not just in the history of our lives, but in the lives of everything. This is the highest they've ever been. And as a result, like we talked about, temperature being very much related to CO2 concentrations, we're seeing our average temperatures increase. And this is where climate is different than weather, because you could say like, oh, we had a really cold winter, or we had, a month in February or a week in February where it was freezing every day. When we're talking about these temperature increases, it's an average across the globe. So even while some areas might experience, some cold periods during the winter, throughout the entire planet, overall, we're warming up. And so these are just some examples of what is happening then on the Earth as a result. And what we're seeing here, these are two different models. So the RCP 4.5 and the RCP 8.5, those are two different computer models that are very powerful. They take into effect all of the different changes that they can calculate from climate change, how much temperature is going to increase, where it's going to increase, and they can correlate that with different weather data, actual weather data. And based on the prediction of how much the climate's going to increase, there's a range. So you might say, oh, it's going to increase 2 degrees or 4 degrees, for example. So these two different models are just giving different predictive ranges, because we don't know. We're trying to figure out what exactly is going to happen. Anyway, what we're showing here are a number of days above 95 degrees each year. And you can see historically on the left, that's pretty similar to where we are now. And as the climate warms in either of these scenarios, the purple indicates more days above 95 degrees. And you can see some areas of the country where it's all white, and then it fills in with the purple and the red and the orange colors, much warmer. So overall, this is just the United States, but across the globe, we're seeing increases in temperature and more extreme temperatures. The precipitation patterns is a little more complicated. So the warming part is a little easier to measure, but some of the other impacts as a result of the warming are a little more complicated. So rainfall patterns are going to shift, meaning that some parts of the world are going to be much drier. Some parts of the world are going to be much wetter, and it could vary from year to year and be unpredictable. You could have in the same place, you could have a flood during one time of the year and then a drought during the growing season. So we're having more intense periods of heavy rain and longer periods of drought. So everything has basically been intensified and a little shaken up. It's a little more random and less predictable and a little more intense in every direction. Dry, wet, hot, cold. So the changes, something that makes it so challenging with these changes to predict what's happening is that we don't know. Again, we're going into unprecedented territory, and things are just getting shaken up and more extreme. And we see this in our hurricanes and tropical storms. So this is because not only is the land surface temperature rising, but ocean temperatures are rising as well. So sunlight hits the ocean and the ocean warms up, it absorbs that heat. But ocean temperatures rising creates more intense storm activity. So this makes our hurricanes more powerful and bigger and more frequent and stronger winds. So their intensity is based on the water temperature. And an increase in 1 degree Fahrenheit will increase the hurricane wind speeds by 15 to 20 miles an hour. So as we get warmer and warmer, our hurricane wind speeds are going to increase. And a lot of our coastal communities feel the brunt of this, and island nations. And a lot of the building codes haven't really been created to withstand these kinds of storms. So we're seeing storms that we didn't expect they would be that powerful. So when they built the houses and the cities and the roads and bridges in those areas, they may not have been designed to withstand these impacts.
And Bill, this is maybe just more trivia than anything, but like if I, my, there were so many hurricanes this season that they actually went beyond their normal naming scheme, because usually they, what is it, like A, B, C, they went through the whole alphabet and then some. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, we had a quite active hurricane season this year. Yes, absolutely. And not only, on the East Coast, but throughout the planet as well. It can be, and they can do a lot of damage. It can be dangerous for people. It can be expensive to repair these things. So there's an economic perspective to it. So this is a real concern.
Thank you.
And so in a result of these intense storms and shifting rainfall patterns, we can see flooding, and this can be a major problem for agriculture. So we can see loss of crops, loss of livestock, soil erosion, water pollution. So if you think about flooding that happens in a parking lot or near a chemical facility, these contaminants can spread and pollute water. So this is a big problem. And then also in our coastal communities, we have an issue of sea level rise. So part of this warming is melting the ice sheets. So Greenland, Antarctica, for example, where areas are normally covered in ice, when we have the warming temperatures, they are less frozen, the ice melts, and that water into the ocean and starts to raise the sea level. And this can be a problem because coastal communities that are already very close to sea level, they see the water start to rise up, and then when you have that combined with a storm event, that's when we see major flooding occur. And on the other hand, like I mentioned, extremes in both directions that are unpredictable. Droughts are going to be more common also. So this is a major impact on food production. And part of it depends on what part of the world you live in or you're farming in, where you might see more water in a coastal area and flooding, making it impossible to grow crops. Or if you're living in more of a dry environment that already has maybe only a little bit of water, this is going to sort of push it over the edge and make it, extreme drought conditions. So California, Great Plains, the Midwest in the United States have been experiencing droughts fairly regularly each year. And so climate change is making that worse. And water supplies being used for irrigation for crops have to be balanced against the freshwater needs of cities and towns. And as we've seen in California, every year we have increased wildfires. So this warming temperatures, the drought conditions, and more wildfires occurring. And so this is, unfortunate and sad. We have loss of human life and infrastructure and agriculture as well. So the vineyards were getting affected in California over the last couple of years. And yeah, you could see the fires in the background. Okay, so now we're going to, that's the end of the gloom and doom.
There you go. I was just gonna say, it's like, oh my gosh, what do we do? But wait, we can solve this. There's mitigation to this.
Yeah, and this is what I get really excited about, and this is the kind of work that I like to focus on. We know there's problems, and it's important to study the problems and the extent of the problems. But what I get excited about is the solutions, because these are solutions that are good for the planet, good for people. They can make jobs, they can save money. It's like a win-win-win situation, these solutions. So this is where I try to stay focused on. It's important to understand the problems, but the solutions are really where it's at. So this term mitigation, and you hear this a lot talking about climate mitigation, this refers to reducing climate change. So just as we were talking about, using fossil fuels has accelerated climate change. So human actions have accelerated climate change. Human actions can also take climate change back and start to control it. We just have to do the right things to go in that direction. So mitigation refers to practices that can lower carbon from the atmosphere and help to combat climate change. And there's two ways to do this. We can reduce the sources of carbon. So remember, the sources are fossil fuels, oil and gas. So if we reduce our reliance on them through more efficient vehicles, more efficient homes, or using renewable energy, solar, wind, hydropower, those are ways that we can reduce the sources of carbon getting into the atmosphere. The other strategy is to increase the sinks for carbon, and that means getting carbon out of the atmosphere and back into the soil. So things like, we talked about plants and trees, for example, that are able to absorb the carbon and put it back into the soil. So we think about how we can work in agriculture and forestry to grow more plants to get more carbon out of the atmosphere. And this example I provide, this is a really new and emerging field. It's called agrivoltaics. And this is putting out solar panels to generate energy and then using the land underneath them to grow crops. So it's two strategies combined on the same piece of land. And this can be used to grow lettuce, for example, that we're seeing here. We've also seen pasture and animals grazed underneath solar panels. And so you have renewable energy being generated to reduce the sources of carbon while producing food and creating a sink for carbon and, providing a local edible crop.
Bill, before you advance, we have a couple comments. I just made one. How do you say that again?
Agrivoltaics, like agriculture and photovoltaics combined.
Okay, well,
Agrivoltaics.
photovoltaics is another word, but anyway, that's a new word for me. So thank you for that. But more seriously, Chris asks, or Christina rather, asks, are there other ways beside using plants to get carbon out of the atmosphere? And then before you answer that real quick, Vivian also said, that's awesome, to the mitigation you just shared. So again, Christina says, are there other ways besides using plants to get carbon out of the atmosphere?
Yeah, and that's a great question, Christina. And that is one of the most cutting edge things that are happening right now are sort of these carbon sink facilities. It's like almost like a reverse power plant that is their carbon. Look up carbon capture technology, and you'll find some really cool things being creative. And they're basically machines or buildings or power plants, I want to call them, that are able to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and sort of pump it and concentrate it and put it back into the earth. So they're just developing them. They're across the world. There's a handful of them as examples that are, really new, brand new technology coming out.
Christina, give me a thumbs up. Did Bill answer your question? Oh, I just got a cool thing. You were one step ahead of me. And then real quick, Bill, you mentioned carbon capture technology, and I've heard you say carbon sink. Is that two words, like carbon and then like a bathroom sink?
So it's kind of
I'm
like
just saying the word itself. Is it one word or two words?
two words, yeah, carbon sink, and we're sinking the carbon into the roots of the plant. So the sink refers to like the destination. Where is it going? So if it's going into plants and into the soil or into the roots of the plants, we're trying to sink it and to get it into those locations where it will be stored and get it out of the atmosphere.
Awesome. Thank you, Bill. And thank you for the questions. Please continue.
Yeah.
If you have any questions, put them in there and we'll ask the expert. Thank you, Bill.
So another piece to all of this is adaptation. And so mitigation and adaptation are two things that we need to address when talking about climate change. And adaptation refers to recognizing that this has happened and adapting to life in a changing climate. And so in our agricultural systems, what changes can we make? In our transportation infrastructure, our buildings in our coastal areas, how do we change to deal with drought and flooding and a more intense wind? So that's adaptation. And so basically what we're doing is reducing our vulnerability to the effects of climate change. So it's sort of having some forethought and designing our farms and our towns and our cities to be able to withstand what we know is coming in terms of the extreme weather events. And so some ways that we can think about making farms more resilient to climate change. On the left, we see a fantastic example of urban agriculture. So producing food in our cities and keeping that as green space and undeveloped, and then also reducing the distance that the food has to travel to get into the city. So it's being produced right there instead of being shipped in from far away from rural areas. So this is one way we can do it. On the right, we see a more rural farm, but you'll notice here only a very small amount of the soil is exposed, and most of it is covered in vegetation. And we'll talk a little more about that strategy to protect the soil, to keep plants growing on it. In nature, you never really see bare soil. It's only through agriculture, when we disturb the soil, we plow it to plant something, that you see it bare. So keeping the soil covered is very important, and we'll see why. So all those plants, any plant that's growing is capturing carbon. So that's one of our goals. Okay, so let's revisit the carbon cycle briefly, just as a reminder. We've got this cycle. Carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is being absorbed by plants. It goes into their roots and into the soil. Some of it gets stored in the soil and some gets respired. So the soil organisms, they're just like you and I, they breathe. And as they exhale carbon dioxide, just like you and I. So this is the cycle. And what plants can do is sequester carbon. So this is like carbon sink, like we were talking about. They're sequestering it, which means they're storing the carbon. So plants are able to store the carbon in their roots and store the carbon underground. So just as human activity was removing the carbon from the soil and putting it into the atmosphere, we can understand this and we can try to move that carbon from the atmosphere back into the soil. So the soil's very important for other reasons as well. So storing the carbon in the soil is a mitigation strategy. So getting the carbon out of the atmosphere to reduce the effects of climate change. But soil health also is an adaptation strategy. So when we have more carbon in the soil, and it's referred to as soil organic matter, and more root system and soil that's covered in plants, it's more resistant to extreme rainfall or drought and some of the changes from climate change. So when we have soil that contains more carbon, it's also an adaptation practice. So less susceptible to erosion, compaction, surface runoff, all these things. It's going to make farmland more productive while also storing carbon. And ways that we can do this, and this is really getting into some of my area of focus of work, is to increase the organic matter. So organic matter is like decomposing leaves, decomposing manure, food scraps, grass clippings, all these things that were plant or animals that used to be alive and they contain carbon. So organic matter, very high in carbon. And when we put that in the soil, it improves the quality of the soil. So up top we see compost. So it's broken down, it's rich, dark. It can hold water, it can hold nutrients, really improve farmland, and it's made up of lots of carbon. So it's beneficial for many different reasons to put this in the soil and to protect it from getting removed from the soil. On the bottom, that picture on the left, that's a plant called crimson clover. And that's being grown in a farm field as a cover crop. And cover crops are plants that are grown on a field just to improve the soil. So it's not, people aren't going to eat it, animals aren't going to eat it. It's being grown to feed the soil, basically. So it's going to put carbon, it's going to put nutrients in the soil, it's covering it to protect it from erosion, from flooding, and it's going to increase the moisture holding capacity. So while those plants are growing, they have their roots going in to the soil. They're all made of carbon, storing that in the soil and improving the productivity, improving the fertility of the soil while also mitigating climate change.
Bill.
Yes.
Maybe could you back, or maybe that you might, I'm going to read the question. You answer if you want to say on this slide, or I just saw a peek of the other one.
Okay.
Do you have any suggestions for winter cover crops that we could do in our home garden beds?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in your home garden beds, what I like to do is something like oats, for example. It's getting a little bit late to plant it now, but if you plant oats in the late summer, it'll grow. And then once it starts to get really cold in the winter, it'll die from the cold naturally. And then when it dies back, you don't have to till it in or anything. It's just creates its own natural mulch and you can plant into it the next year. So oats are a good one for that. If you want to grow something that will live through the winter, winter cover crop would be like winter rye. And so that's similar. It's another grass grain species, but that one will survive through the winter and then continue growing in the spring. So that you just have to, if you have a tiller or a tractor or something, you'll have to till that into the soil to manage it. So either of those are good options depending on how you want to use them.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Bill. And thank you for the question, Vivian.
So that's a good segue. So we're talking about tillage. So in most farming, tillage refers to plowing our fields, getting them ready to plant. So modern farming uses tractors and plows and rototillers, and the advantage to that is that you get a nice, loose, crumbly soil to put your plants into. The roots can grow into it. It gets nutrients get incorporated, and that's why we do that. However, this releases carbon from the soil. So anytime we till, it's breaking up the organic matter into smaller pieces, and carbon dioxide is released. It's like the soil is exhaling a big breath of carbon dioxide anytime it gets tilled. So there's practices called conservation tillage, where we're only tilling little spots, or no-till, where you're not even tilling the soil at all and just planting right into, like I was saying, the oats that die down and make a straw mulch. And you just keep planting into mulch, and each year that carbon builds up. So different practices for agriculture to store carbon. And this also reduces drought and flood damages because the soil's not covered, or the soil is covered. Anytime the soil is bare, it can wash away, it can blow away, and you lose that resource. Managing irrigation and conserving water, another major component in agriculture to look at climate change, especially as our water resources become more limited. So on the left, this is a technology called drip irrigation. And if you see those on those rows of plants, that's lettuce planted there. And we're in a very dry area. You can see the surrounding vegetation. It's very brown and dry. So there's limited water resources here. But if you want to grow something that requires irrigation, these drip emitters, drip irrigation, they have very small holes in the hoses that are running out, and they just drip by drip, slowly but constantly, put that water right into the root zone of the plants. So you can see in the walkways where the weeds would grow, we're not watering, we're not wasting water. It's not being sprayed overhead where it would evaporate. It's just getting put very efficiently right in the root zone. So drip irrigation is a great water conservation strategy. And on the right, we're looking at mulch. And so you can, spread mulch by hand in your garden, or get something like this. This is really an innovative way to get mulch onto a large portion of ground. It's just rolling it right out with that tractor. And so mulch is going to cover up the soil and prevent water from evaporating. It's going to prevent erosion because it's covered, and it's adding carbon to the system. So all of that mulch is organic matter. It's all made of carbon. So you're adding that to the field and sequestering that carbon over time. Another really interesting area is plant breeding. And so we've seen tremendous advances in plant breeding over the last 50 years, especially. And we've been able to produce more food on less land. Our plants have become more productive and more efficient. But now we need to start breeding for climate smart plants, basically. So incorporating into those high yielding plants, we need to think about breeding for plants that are more drought tolerant or heat tolerant or salt tolerant in terms of salt water getting into our coastal areas. So plant breeders are now starting to look in this direction, and this is a really interesting field of science. Plant breeding to be more stress tolerant and require less nutrients, less water to still produce the same yield. So it can also grow plants that have bigger root systems, which means storing more carbon, stabilizing more soil. And so these are sort of new directions for plant breeding.
Oh, before you go much further, literally right now, Lauren asks, with such plants that are tolerant to climate change impacts, how do GMOs fit into this conversation? And what are some of the potential implications of using GMOs?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, people are approaching this from all different angles. So there are traditional plant breeders who are going about by the regular methods of crossing two plants with one another and collecting the seed over generations and field testing them, who are working on producing plants that are stress tolerant. And then there are others who work in the field of genetic modification, trying to look for what genes are responsible for improving drought tolerance or heat tolerance. And they're working on this as well. And I think, from the scientific community right now, it's recognizing how important this is for trying to feed the world, because at the same time, we have to remember the population is still growing. So the global population is growing very quickly every year. So we have these increased challenges of climate change for agriculture while we're having more people to feed and needing to, we can't just say that our food production right now for the globe can stay as it is. It needs to increase year to year, and by quite a bit, to meet the needs, the nutritional needs of everybody on the planet. So scientists and plant breeders are approaching this from every direction possible, just to try to come up with the best solution.
All right. Thank you for the question, Lauren, and thank you, Bill, for the thoughtful answer. And Lauren says, thank you so much.
And I'll say too, all of our breeding methods are also no substitute for healthy soil management. So I mentioned I'm a soil scientist, but whatever seeds or anything you grow, you will all be better if we're doing these soil conservation techniques as well. Okay, so thinking about something that we can all do also, and maybe you've thought of this before, or maybe you haven't thought of this before, but how far does your food travel? So where is the farm that's producing the lettuce or the pepper or the tomato that you're eating? And this is a way that we can all think about mitigating climate change. So the transportation, the fuel and refrigeration involved to move food from the farm to the plate essentially can be a heavy toll in producing carbon. So this is contributing to climate change. So we're 2,800 miles from California, which is one of the major lettuce producing regions of the country. So a lot of lettuce is coming out of there, and that's a long way to go for a head of lettuce. Peppers you see often come from Holland, and tomatoes from Mexico. And so these are quite a bit of distance and energy and resources required to move this food around. So when we can, Jersey Fresh, New Jersey is the garden state, and we have an abundance of local farms in this state, and we can't always produce all of the things. We can't grow bananas here, so that's one thing. But in the summer, you can get great tomatoes and peaches and onions and all kinds of vegetables that you could want right in our own state. So thinking about trying to reduce those food miles is a way that we can all contribute. This is another cutting edge area of agriculture that I think is really cool, and people might not have thought of this before. And so on the right, this is a rooftop hydroponic production system. So there's no soil in any of these pictures, no soil is involved. And these systems use water or with a nutrient solution, or just spraying a mist of nutrient solution on the roots of the plants to provide them with the fertility. And the water gets filtered and recycled, so it's very efficient for water use. There's no soil getting disturbed, and as you can see, we're able to put these greenhouses right on top of a building and produce food. So that's land that you wouldn't think would be productive and for producing food, and there you go. And also, if you look at the top right picture, there's solar panels on the roof of that building where the greenhouses are not located. So surrounding the greenhouses are solar panels. So very cool hydroponic operation. And on the bottom left, this is a vertical aeroponic operation. So we have some of these in Monmouth County that are in old shipping containers, and each shipping container, like what would fit on the back of a tractor trailer, can produce as much greens as a 2-acre farm. They use a fraction of the amount of water. They use LED lights and no soil. And so this, if people are interested in, this is more like engineering and math and computers, because it's a sophisticated computer program that's controlling all the nutrient solutions and the pH and the salinity level and when things are ready to harvest. So you're not even getting dirty or getting into the soil or anything like that. It was just a really, so really interesting new cutting edge way to produce a lot of food, especially in our urban areas. And then I don't have a picture of it here, but aquaponics takes these hydroponic water circulation systems and adds fish to it. So the fish are circulating through the water, the nutrients from the fish are being used to grow the plants, and then that water comes back to the fish. So that's a super efficient system to produce both fish and vegetables. And one of the most important things that we can do, that we can think about, is to plant trees, to reforest the entire planet. And so this is a great article, and I've got a link to this article itself, but then also an explanation of it from NASA. So in the journal Science, there is a team, international team of researchers, and they calculated that the Earth right now can support another 2.2 billion acres of forest, or 25% more forested area than we have now. So we can plant, it's about 500 billion trees across the planet. So it's a major effort, but it would capture enough carbon that it would reduce it from the atmosphere by about 25%. And so that would take our, that point that we saw ourselves on the curve with the carbon dioxide levels being through the roof, it would take us back about 20 years reverse on that curve. So all human produced carbon would go back about 20 years if we could do this. But we see, tremendous losses from deforestation in the Amazon rainforest, especially, forested land is being cleared for agriculture, and trees are much more efficient at capturing and storing carbon than any other plant on the planet. So this is a really interesting area of research, and just the benefits of reforesting unvegetated areas for the ecosystem are tremendous. And it doesn't have to be limited to rural areas. So another really cool area is green infrastructure, incorporating green spaces into urban areas, rooftop gardens, rooftop forests, incorporating plants throughout the city, on buildings, in buildings, surrounding the walkways. And this is where it gets really creative, and where you can start to think about, you'll probably think of ideas that no one's ever thought of before. And so that's sort of the challenge, but also the excitement to it, is to bring this about. And so it has great implications for combating climate change and just for making areas greener, better places to live. The trees and the plants are also clearing the water, they're cleaning the air in the city. And so there's no reason we can't think outside the box and start to create green spaces like this. So that's the end of the talk. All of these links will take you to some of the stories and the resources that were throughout this lecture, and we can share these with you for sure. And yeah, I'll be happy to take any more questions.
All right. Well, Bill, on behalf of all of our participants here today, I'd like to say thank you. This was very informative. So before we wrap things up here this afternoon, to echo Bill's thoughts there, does anyone have any comments, any questions, anything that they would like to ask an expert here this afternoon? I'm watching the chat pod, and I see a few of the screens. I see some people typing, so you may have some questions coming, Bill. We hear from Lauren, says thank you so much. Abby says thank you. Christina says thank you. So I echo their sentiments. Thank you, Bill. This was very informative. We got
Absolutely
some more things here.
And if you have any questions or something you need clarified or another resource, just send me an email. That's my email address there. So as you're preparing your papers and everything, just yeah, feel free to reach out to me. I'm here. I'm available.
Bill, we have a couple questions.
Okay.
Woo! So Lauren says, would you be able to speak? Is to say, Lauren, are you asking like today to speak today, or do you want to give like a presentation? Yeah, so Lauren, just go ahead and unmute yourself.
Okay, hi. No, I wasn't sure if we only like wanted to type to, keep everything in the chat. So I apologize if that was unclear.
Oh, no.
No, this was really, unfortunately, I only got to come at like 4:30 because I don't know, I couldn't find the link, but so I missed a lot of it, but it's just interesting for me because I'm coming from a completely different perspective. So I'm a PhD candidate in global affairs, and my dissertation is on food insecurity in sub-Saharan Africa, and basically how land grabbing affects women's food insecurity. And so when I asked the question about GMOs, like I had a whole different perspective, but it's because of a disciplinary difference, so you're coming from like a scientific, so I just like really appreciated the different perspectives on the same exact issue. So yeah, I just wanted to say thank you for a different perspective. Yeah.
And Lauren, I want to thank you for joining us. I'm just going to say it. This was designed for high school youth. So for a PhD.
Oh, I didn't know.
No.
Okay, cool.
I'm going to say, I mean, for our high schoolers that are on here, like,
Yeah.
I hope that you hold your chins up a little higher here. I mean, you were part of the session that a PhD candidate found you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's awesome.
Thank you for participating, Lauren.
Of course. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Bill, Anita asked, where in Monmouth County can you visit a hydroponic container?
Okay, so there's a few places. One is called Drop the Beat Farm. He's in Farmingdale. His name is Cody Parker, and he actually does hydroponic and aquaponic systems for schools as well. So he has a whole educational program about that. So it's Drop the Beat, Cody Parker. There's another place called Beyond Organics, and that's in Freehold. They have the vertical growing systems. And then a third place is called Three Forks Farm. And those are the ones that are the shipping containers. And those containers are actually located in a Dunkin' Donuts parking lot in Lincroft. And they have 2 shipping containers, and they're growing as much as a 4-acre farm. So I don't know if they give tours there regularly, but that's called Three Forks Farm, and they're actually Rutgers graduates. So those are 3 places. And I'll also mention, if you go to the Grown in Monmouth website, there's a map that you can look at that has all sorts of different farms and the hydroponic operations. And I think all 3 of those farms are members of Grown in Monmouth. So if you go to that, and Matt, maybe you can drop the Grown in Monmouth link in the chat.
I'm going to do that shortly. First things first, though, I am going to stop recording right